Well, I have a bit of a confession to make about my topic. I come at this not with any expertise whatever on the Canadian military or on any kind of military organization at all. My area of study is employment equity policy and its implementation and the extent to which it's effective under various conditions. And so I was asked to apply that employment equity lens to the Canadian Forces, which is what I've done in this paper. And it was an interesting exercise for me because I got to know a little bit about the Canadian Forces. The paper itself covers the sort of territory that's shown here, beginning with the proposition that Canada's dilemma is really systemic racism toward Indigenous people, and the outcome of that, for purposes of our discussion now, is the responsibility of today's Canadian Forces to address that situation within its own domain. The issue for the Canadian Forces, it seems now, is a long-standing pattern of underrepresentation of Indigenous people, and that's something that we'll talk about. An employment equity lens, which I'm bringing to the topic, is looking at how to identify and remove barriers to equal access and career development for Indigenous people, in the sense of creating an environment for accommodation rather than assimilation in the working environment. And an important part of that is special programs to address the unique situation and needs of Indigenous people. I have developed an analysis based on looking at data about the Canadian Forces over the last 10 years in three ways, looking at numerical representation of Indigenous people in the Canadian Forces at different levels, on employment policies and practices which govern the access to the Canadian Forces and what happens to people's careers once they're inside the organization, and looking at organizational culture, how people experience the workplace. I look at the Canadian Forces in relationship to the Employment Equity Act and the sort of exchange that takes place with the audit that is done of employers under the Employment Equity Act, and find that there's been a rather troubled relationship between the Canadian Forces and employment equity. And ultimately, the question for me is, will the Canadian Forces find a path to inclusiveness and equity for Indigenous people? I think I don't want to go into a lot of detail on this topic of systemic racism toward Indigenous people, because that would take a long time. But I want to suggest that there are two levels on which it makes sense to look at this with regards to the topic of today. The first is at the macro level, at the level of Canadian society and governance. We have the sort of structure of the system of colonial relations, which has essentially structured the relationship between Indigenous people and other Canadians. And two important aspects of that are the Indian Act and the betrayal of the system of treaties that were put into place over time between the Canadian state, or the British first and then the Canadian state, and the various First Peoples. Peter Russell's new book, Canadian Odyssey, gives a very interesting analysis of this system and how it came into place. Then beyond that macro level, we come to the organizational level, which is the level at which the Canadian Forces then becomes an organization which has been influenced by this system of colonial relations over time, and which at the organizational level presents systemic barriers to the entry and career development of Indigenous people. It has in the past, and some of those barriers continue now. So, what is the responsibility of today's Canadian Forces toward Indigenous people? I'm suggesting that there are a couple of legal responsibilities that the Canadian Forces has as an organization. One is to comply with the Canadian Human Rights Act, which is about guaranteeing a discrimination-free environment for everyone. The second is the Employment Equity Act, and this is interesting because the Canadian Forces is the largest employer covered by the Employment Equity Act, which makes certain requirements of employers to attempt to remove discriminatory barriers and to create a discrimination-free workplace. And that's something that I'll spend a bit of time on in this talk. Third is the system of treaty rights under which Indigenous people are entitled to justice and accountability in their dealings with the Canadian state. And fourth, the Canadian Forces as a central institution of the Canadian state has an obligation to be a representative bureaucracy, which in sort of the political science analysis means that the government organization should be reflective of the society of which it's a part. And it should represent the community of people that pay the taxes to keep that government institution going. And it should be a representative bureaucracy in the sense that members of the public, citizens, should be able to expect that if their children wanted to become part of that institution for which they are providing support, that they could be. So a representative bureaucracy is one that is not only reflective of the society that it serves, but is also open to opportunity to share the benefits that it may provide with everyone. I think, too, as a central institution of the Canadian states, the Canadian Forces has an obligation to be a model employer. And what I mean by that is that this should be a leading employer. It should show the way to other government institutions and other institutions in the private sector in terms of providing progressive human resources management practices and employment practices. But we can't expect that the private sector is going to be the leader necessarily in doing this. It should be the government that is legislating that there should be equal opportunity for all, that should show the way for employers to make that happen. And finally, we have the challenge of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to all Canadians, that it's now at long last time to take action to reconcile with Indigenous people and to figure out what our responsibilities are to make that happen. The issue for the Canadian Forces in terms of there being a long-standing pattern of underrepresentation of Indigenous people, which I'll illustrate in a moment. But the issue is, I think, twofold. First of all, there's the question of compliance with the Employment Equity Act, which does require that employers show an effort to attain a representative workforce, a workforce that has representation that is drawn from the populations from which it recruits people, so that it is a reflection then of that workforce. Secondly, the Canadian Forces actually needs Indigenous people to meet its labor force needs. Why? Well, because the Indigenous population in Canada is a growing population, a young population, and an increasingly educated population, increasingly urbanized, and all employers of the future, not just the Canadian Forces, are going to have to count more and more on the Indigenous population to meet the labor force needs that they will have. And that's particularly true in parts of Canada such as Manitoba and Saskatchewan and in the north, where Indigenous people are going to form a very major part of the labor force. So there's a mutual benefit here that could be derived if Canadian Forces and Indigenous people can work together to have an employment relationship which meets the needs of both. But having those mutual benefits depends on reducing systemic racism and sexism. The fact that there is systemic racism and sexism in the Canadian Forces has been identified in a plethora of internal and external research studies and surveys of members and so on. So I don't have time today to go through all of that evidence, but it is ample. To bring an employment equity lens to looking at a workplace means identifying barriers to the equal access and career development, in this case for Indigenous peoples, but also under the Employment Equity Act for women, members of racialized groups, and persons with disabilities. So those are the four groups that are covered under the Employment Equity Act. And in the case of our discussion today, we're talking about Indigenous peoples, but of course we're also talking about women, because Indigenous peoples come in two genders. Let's not forget that, even though it's the point that I'll make later is that this is something that the Canadian Forces really hasn't seemed to pay much attention to. Indigenous women seem to be invisible pretty much for the way that the Canadian Forces goes about things. So once these barriers to access and career development have been identified, they need to be removed. And we need to have policies and practices which create disadvantage and inequality for some and privilege for others based on identity. We need to have those discriminatory barriers removed and replaced by practices that are fair to everyone. And we're talking here about practices which are embedded in everyday behavior, both formal and informal, that often are unseen. We're unaware of them, they are unacknowledged, but through critical scrutiny we can identify what those barriers are. And we can replace them with policies and practices that are fair. An employment equity analysis would also look at how differences can be accommodated rather than forcing people to assimilate to a culture that is not theirs. So the Employment Equity Act requires employers to accommodate differences short of undue hardship. That is the language in the Act. So the Act doesn't expect employers to turn themselves inside out to do special things for people, but it does require that a reasonable effort be made to accommodate difference. It also requires employers to put into place special programs to help minorities to succeed in the workplace and to help them enter the workplace. And the Canadian Forces certainly has examples of such programs for Indigenous people. We heard about some of those from the Brigadier General who spoke this morning. The Bold Eagle program, the Raven program, Black Bear, all of these provide basic military training combined with teachings about Indigenous culture by Indigenous counselors and elders to provide a kind of way that Indigenous people can get a first-hand experience of what it would be like to be in the Canadian Forces and consider a career there for themselves. The Canadian Forces Aboriginal Entry Program is an introduction to military life. The Canadian Forces Aboriginal Leadership Opportunity Year is a preparatory year at the Royal Military College leading to undergraduate studies and a possible career in the Canadian Forces. And these are programs that provide a bridge into careers in the Canadian Forces, which participants in those programs report very positive experiences with. But there's little publicly available data, at least on the contribution of those programs to recruitment. However, I would regard them as special programs that have real merit in terms of accomplishing the kind of goal that they've set out to accomplish. And as we've heard in the previous panel, the Rangers is kind of a special case, which certainly is a very positive and I think rich opportunity to combine entry into the forces with a real operational benefit for the organization. So the purpose of all this is to prevent systemic discrimination from persisting. So if we look at the numerical representation of Indigenous people, we see here that over time it has improved, but it still remains far short of the employment equity goal that Canadian Forces has set for itself. In the regular forces and primary reserves, it's only up to 2.6% right now. And if we include the Rangers and the cadet instructor cadre, which is the Coates group, it rises to 3.9%, which is, with a pretty good level of representation. But we have to remember that today's representation of Indigenous people in the population is about 4.9%. So it's still a big gap between where we are and where we could be. There is also data that I have looked at, which is quite striking, of a low level of representation among officers, a lower representation than one would like to see among hires, high attrition of non-commissioned reserve members. So these are issues when it comes to the overall population of the Canadian Forces in terms of Indigenous membership. These data come from the Canadian Forces annual reports that are required under the Employment Equity Act. These reports include numbers of both Aboriginal men and women. And Indigenous women form about 20% of all the Indigenous members in the Canadian Forces, which is interesting because if you look at the total Aboriginal forces, women comprise about 15% of the total. So the representation of Aboriginal women is quite significant, and if the desire is to increase the representation of Aboriginal people in the Canadian Forces, why not look at how to increase the representation of women even more? But Indigenous women are really invisible in all of the documents that I've reviewed. They're invisible in the employment equity reports. They're invisible in other reports that have been done internally and externally about the situation of of Indigenous people and visible minorities in the Canadian Forces. So women form a potentially valuable pool of recruits, as well as obviously an important component of the Canadian Forces as they are now. Very briefly, employment policies and practices are the things that guide decision-making about entry to the Canadian Forces and the experience that people have serving. It is a requirement under the Employment Equity Act that an employer conducts an employment systems review, which is a fairly intensive exercise to critically scrutinize how decisions about people are made and to identify any barriers that are in the way of fair and equal representation. So I was not given access to the Employment Equity Systems Review report, among many other documents that I wanted to get access to, but I wasn't given those documents. So I can't tell you about what they have said to identify barriers, but I can suggest that there are several barriers that are very obvious when we think about recruitment and the attraction that the Canadian Forces may have for potential recruits. And these are barriers that were identified in focus group research and in survey research that's been done. One of them is the issue of deployment far from family and community and continual relocation of people. Clearly that is a barrier for Indigenous men and women. It's a barrier in the sense of unwillingness to be separated from family and community ties. It's a very difficult thing for anyone to raise a family under those conditions. And it certainly, I believe, forms a barrier to recruitment. There are reports as well of a fear of culture shock, of harassment. And there is plenty of evidence of harassment and discrimination that members experience. And fear of PTSD, pressures to assimilate. Sometimes negative views of the Canadian Forces and its dealings with Indigenous peoples in the past. A lack of Indigenous recruiters. Oftentimes it was reported that recruiters are sent out to Indigenous communities that have no ability to connect with those communities because they lack information and awareness. And I think fundamentally a failure of the Canadian Forces to form relationships with Indigenous communities and leaders is a fundamental barrier. And I would suggest that the way forward would be to remedy that situation by putting a lot of effort into forming relationships with local communities and with leaders in those communities. And I think I have to stop now.